Imagine this. You're a host. You wake up, grab your coffee, open your Airbnb dashboard, and right there at the top of the search results in your market is something you've never seen before. A hotel room. Not a boutique stay, not a stylish apartment, but a standard hotel listing. Now competing directly with your home on the very platform you rely on for bookings. And this move comes right on the back of another big shift earlier this year. Airbnb announcing new cancellation rules, a 24-hour free cancellation window, the phasing out of strict policies, reserve now, pay later. Airbnb is moving fast, and the changes aren't small tweaks. They're strategic pivots that affect how guests book, how hosts operate, and how the entire short-term rental ecosystem functions. This week on The Check-In, we're diving into what's behind Airbnb's transformation, the hotel pilot, the flexibility policies, the signals from their latest earnings, and what all of this means for hosts, operators, and the broader short-term rental industry as Airbnb evolves into something very different from the platform many of us started with. Because Airbnb 2.0 isn't just coming, it's here. Welcome back to The Check-In. Hi, Leo. How's it going, buddy?
Hey, Sarah. I'm very good, my friend. It's great to see you. Let's get into it. So we've had some great episodes so far. I've got to say, I really enjoyed, I've enjoyed all our guest hosts so far that we've had, but I really particularly enjoyed hearing you and James talk about the business last week and getting into some of the detail of things. We had a great reaction on social media around this idea of how do you do the Airbnb side hustle remotely? Is it possible? How, is it becoming harder? Is it becoming easier? And it was a really interesting debate. So yeah, really enjoyed that. I'm sure you did too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. James is a perfect example. He's so funny. When I asked him to come on, he said, I don't know if you want me on your podcast. I mean, I'm just a little host. And I said, James, that's what the whole industry is built on. And so it was actually perfect. It was great to hear from his perspective, I think, of as well how some of these changes are impacting. And also, Airbnb has always sort of touted this can be a side hustle thing. And I think James was a good example of the fact that that's not necessarily true. It still can be, but you really have to buy extremely well. And you have to be very careful about what you're investing into that property in terms of renovation and mostly in terms of the people that you set up if you're going to manage that from afar.
And it's a bugbear for me. I really dislike when people talk about professional hosts as being hosts that look after multiple listings, 20, 30, 40 units. Professional hosts should be every host. Every host should aspire to be professional in how they present themselves. And I think it's really, really important to remember that you have the data for this with AirDNA. The vast majority of hosts look after one or two listings, right? But they are setting out 100% to be professional and to ensure that they're providing the highest possible service to our guests. And that's what makes our industry really exciting, because you're not just building tools for big hotel flags and a few different clients. You build them for literally millions of different hosts that might work in a slightly different way. It's what makes our industry so exciting. Well, look, today, as Sarah said in her title, we're deep diving Airbnb. It's about time, because there's been a lot going on. What is going on at Airbnb at the moment, and where are they, and who are they focused on, and essentially what's motivating them beyond the obvious, which is share price and shareholders? So today we're unpacking the biggest strategic shift that Airbnb's made in years and the ripple effects of it as it comes out across the short-term rental ecosystem. So look, Sarah, let's start with looking at Q3 for Airbnb.
Yeah, sure. So Q3 was pretty much what you would expect for a hospitality company, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But revenue, $4.1 billion, which was up 10%. So actually decent numbers in terms of margin, EBITDA at about 50%. So this is the biggest number that Airbnb has ever posted. Definitely something to keep an eye out for. Nights booked up 9%. And what we're seeing is that still the biggest expansion for Airbnb is in areas that historically have not been their key markets, such as Latin America and APAC. Interestingly enough, of course, as we always talk about, what happened to Airbnb stock after they post these wonderful Q3 earnings that for any other normal hospitality stock would have been great? Their stock went down. So we were having a chat about this earlier, Leo, but we've long had this conversation on the podcast that Airbnb is an interesting one, similar to what happened with both Vacasa and with Sonder. And this is evidenced by who is attending in terms of the analyst. So who's attending the earnings calls for each of these stocks? What surprised me the most when Airbnb first IPO'd was that on the initial earnings, the first earnings call and on the IPO call, the analysts that were joining were not the same analysts that join Booking.com and Expedia calls and the rest of the hospitality calls that you might follow. They were analysts that the rest of the stocks they were covering were more tech stocks. And so I think this is also part of the Sonder Marriott debacle. It's part of what happened with Vacasa. These stocks, when they IPO'd, they were valued and thus had the expectation of growth of a tech stock, not of a hospitality stock. This is evidenced by who the major hedge funds decided to put as analysts on these and which teams those stocks sat under. And curiously, now we're starting to see some shifts in this, either as those analysts are moving, they're moving teams, or Airbnb is becoming more and more part of that sort of hospitality stock portfolio group. So let's see if they finally start to get it right. But it definitely is great evidence for the fact that this has always been valued, in my opinion, inappropriately for what it actually is.
Yeah, and it's not, you're right, it shouldn't be valued as a tech stock. It's good old-fashioned hospitality. It's bums on chairs, it's heads on beds, right? It's done in a much less consistent way as well than, for example, relying on hotel inventory, which once the hotel gets built and the bedrooms are there, they will be there until the hotel falls down or is in some way replaced by something else, which is more the Booking.com model. And I think that the consistency in Booking.com stock price and why it's maybe seen as a safer stock is driven by the fact that it's predictable. It's scalable in the sense that, you know, you build a hotel, you keep that hotel on the books, the next one comes on the books, and they've got a more diversified spread across the across the hospitality industry. So we're talking hotels, short-term rentals, flights, car hire, right? So they're more across that vertical. So I think Airbnb has ridden the wave of being a tech stock, and I think people are now looking at it and saying, well, actually, it's a hospitality company, and its supply is not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed for two reasons. One, houses get sold. Was it like divorce and death is the thing that keeps the property market going? You know, like it's so anyway, without regulatory headwinds, property moves around, people change the usage of it, areas come up and down in valuation, so people sell properties, move out, move in. But then you have these regulatory headwinds as well, which we're going to talk more and more about, especially next week when we go into over-tourism as a concept. This idea that, you know, the traditional hotel market, you could only have enough, you had enough rooms and it was very hard to add rooms because you needed to get planning permission. What we've seen with the birth of tech-enabled short-term rentals is that there was a huge boom, and then that boom has started to reduce as certain areas have decided to regulate. And I don't think that nothing happens in a bubble, so we can't ignore that, which I think explains some of the things we're going to go on to talk about further in the episode when it comes to what's motivating Airbnb right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where they're expanding and the markets where they're growing is an indication of this. So their traditional markets, US, Canada, Europe, they're all tightening. So this is constricting their supply. They've got regulation, they've got rental caps, they've got registration requirements, all of this making it much more difficult to have that elasticity of supply that you just mentioned. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. And Airbnb is looking for ways to grow. They're looking for ways to grow their revenue, and they're looking for ways to capture more guests. So a lot of these changes that they've been making, for example, around the cancellation policies or the buy now, pay later, this is all about making the booking process more flexible for guests. It's nothing to do with keeping host sweet, is it?
But that's it, and that's probably the right move, isn't it? You know, and I guess we'll let's talk about that before we talk about anything else. Then, but the loyalty of your guest is even more important than it was 6 months, a year ago, because of the challenge of AI. So what stops that guest doing what you're starting to do, because you're a ChatGPT junkie, I'm going to say. So what's going to stop Sarah, who previously might have been an OTA booker, going on and just booking it on ChatGPT in the future when it's possible? You know, you're looking for the best rate, you're looking for the best experience, you're looking for the quality. You're not necessarily caring which OTA you find it on. It's the end product you want to make sure is genuine. So again, that play for the guest is so important if Airbnb is going to survive this change in how people are browsing for things, right?
I completely agree. I also think this change is tied very closely with another change that they made, which is the incorporation of hotel inventory, like we discussed in the opening of this episode. Hotels have always been more flexible. They've always had a lot more flexible purchasing process, this buy now, pay later, or pay once you check in, or sometimes even pay when you check out. They have had more flexible cancellation policies. So all of this is really leaning into the addition of that inventory. And I can see Airbnb making some of those changes preemptively before bringing on a lot of this hotel stock to make sure that the regulations or the rules of play, I guess we could say, are more homogenous with the entire supply on the site.
Here we go. Hotels, right? Hasn't this been tried before?
This has been tried before. The main difference here, so hotels, for all of our listeners, hotels are not new to Airbnb. Hotels have been listed on Airbnb for quite some time now. The difference is that those hotels traditionally have been either boutique hotels, more of sort of like an apart hotel, so a Pierre and Vacances, or maybe some of these timeshare properties that are really popular in a lot of places in North America. So it's not new necessarily. What is new is the fact that these have all been a lot more aligned with sort of what Airbnb's traditional brand was. So either they've been apartments or they've been unique. So this sort of boutique where every single room has a different theme, or a bed and breakfast type hotel operator. Whereas now, with the integration with Hotel Tonight, it is just straight up hotels. So here, they're really getting into a place where they're going to be able, potentially, assuming it goes well, to directly compete with, for example, an Expedia or Booking.com for the first time. This also makes me even more proud of the fact that my theory is correct about Airbnb being a hospitality company, because they're doing exactly what the other hospitality companies are doing. They've tried to launch other things. They've tried to launch the experiences. They've tried to launch this ancillary services. But ultimately, the biggest move is them getting into traditional hotel inventory. Why is this happening? A couple of reasons. The biggest one is the fact that their major markets have massive regulation challenges. So in a market like Barcelona, where if you can't operate in Barcelona or London or Amsterdam, you have a problem. These are huge markets, and this is just Europe. You look at places in the US, if you can't operate in New York City, you can't operate in San Francisco, you have a problem. So Airbnb isn't stupid. They know that they need supply in these areas if they're not going to become obsolete. And hotels are the legal, easy way to get that supply.
It's hard not to sound a little bit smug, isn't it? Because we poured a lot of cold water on the experiences launch, and we continue to enjoy pouring cold water on it. So, you know, I'm sort of refraining from sort of smiling too much as I say it, but I believe that when we talked about this previously, that was our bet, right? That they're talking about experiences, they're talking about owning that, you know, the everything app, you know, the fact that you might connect with someone after an experience, the fact that you might go and book that experience when you're not even staying in a short-term rental, the fact that you can get a fridge fill and things like that. We both agreed that that's not really where Airbnb belongs. Let the hospitality provider provide the hospitality. But doubling down on the inventory side of it does make a ton of sense, because essentially that's what people know when they're doing their usual browsing behavior. That's what they know they can get from Airbnb. So you're exactly right. Let's talk about the holes in the map. Suddenly, New York City, Barcelona, there will be more. Unfortunately, there will be more. And again, we need to wrestle with that as an industry and work out where we sit and where we belong in the vertical. Are we destined to be in hospitality-focused towns and resorts and villages and mountain towns with skiing because that's where the need is? And are we less likely to be in the urban? We're going to discuss that over the next couple of weeks. Airbnb's reaction to that, of course, is let's fill the holes in the map. And as a consequence, if I'm a host, that suddenly has changed the game, because I bought into this idea that I was part of this revolution in hosting. And of course, Airbnb as a private company was able to keep riding that wave for as long as they wanted, because ultimately, when you're a private company, you can keep telling the story you want to tell. And when you're a public company, you need to make sure that you're bringing value for money for your shareholders. And of course, the likely comparison then is Expedia, Booking.com. They're the stocks that will be looked at for comparison. So this is a reaction to, I think it's a defensive move. They can't tell us this is part of their brand story, because it just isn't. That's baloney. This is a defensive move. The interesting thing would be, what next then? So do we think that, it even feels strange saying it, but I'm going to say it, like, do we feel that Airbnb starts to get into flight comparison, car rental? I mean, that feels wrong, but here they are getting with hotels. So who knows?
It's not outside of the realm of possibilities. For me, this is part of the announcement that they didn't really flesh out fully, which was, we want to be the everything app. Well, that includes transportation. That includes all these things. So basically what they're saying to me is, we want to become Expedia or Booking, and we're getting into all these things they're getting into because people are finally starting to realize that they're a hospitality stock. The other thing that I think is interesting, and this really changes the game for hosts, with the addition of hotel inventory and with the changes in booking behavior that we're seeing over time and that we're going to continue to see, both with younger generations as well as with the use of some of these AI tools to book things, that flexibility for the guest, whether that relates to buy now, pay later, whether that relates to less strict cancellation policies, these are all things that have been around for a long time in hotels. Where Airbnb was traditionally, and vacation rentals, if I look at vacation rentals that my family will rent the same beach house every year for the same week, and those normally are booked a year in advance and they're non-refundable, and there's all of these conditions which we've just sort of accepted for our industry. But if the platform where you're booking is changing the rules because they're adding inventory where that historically has not been the case, where things are more flexible, this is going to put pressure on hosts of Airbnb as well to come up to speed. And especially if you're a company, perhaps that's different because you have a team. You can better manage some of that inventory. You're likely using a fairly powerful PMS. You might have the ability to have larger discounts and things like that. If you're a single host, it's going to be a lot trickier, especially if you can't rely on some of the OTAs or on OpenAI, let's say, to start getting you those bookings. And if they're direct bookings, it's even more difficult. So I'm thinking about a company where 70% of their bookings are direct, let's say. If they have a much less strict cancellation policy because of an Airbnb or another OTA, or simply because the status quo has changed of what guests expect, how is that going to trickle in? And how is that going to impact especially larger properties? So that's a big difference between a hotel and an Airbnb that everybody should be aware of, right? You have a hotel, they might have 100 rooms. So if one of their rooms gets canceled, it's not going to affect their bottom line too much. If you're an Airbnb host and you have a 5-bedroom villa in a small town in Italy and you get a last-minute cancellation, good luck filling that. You have one property. It's a much bigger risk. And so I think this is part of what isn't really being accounted for in some of the changes. But I don't know that guests understand that nuance. And ultimately, Airbnb multiple times over has sided with the guest, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for me as a guest of an Airbnb property. But for host, it's definitely more complicated.
This is the gamble. As per usual, you've said the smartest thing, so I won't try and copy what you've said. I'll try and add on to it if possible. The hotel offers those cancellation terms because those cancellation terms are completely acceptable to the hotel because they don't expect to be 100% full ever, which is why, when it's busier, they're not going to start trying to pluck for 100% occupancy. They'd rather keep the room rates high and get it to 80%, right? And conversely, in low season, again, they don't need to sell them for £1 a night just to fill them. It's about getting a decent amount of people through the door, do a conference, do a wedding, whatever it might be. Totally different. It's a totally different game, like supply strategy for a hotel, completely different. And in trying to pursue guest loyalty, they are running the risk of losing host loyalty. I was drinking on 2 nights ago with a host in my town, who I'll name actually because I'm sure he'd very publicly say it. Steve Taggart said to me 12 months ago when I was having a similar conversation with him, he said, I'm very happy for Airbnb to be my biggest source of bookings. I'm glad it's not my only one, but I'm really please, which would be my biggest source. That's changed over the last 12 months. Why? Because he feels less secure about the bookings that he gets. The fee structure has changed. The clarity that's needed for guests is completely logical because they have to compete with Booking.com and Expedia and make sure that no fees are hidden. We totally get where Airbnb are coming from, but if you're a host, it changes the game. And again, back to this idea that it's super flexible for a guest means that they feel that they would rather go and get that booking themselves or use Booking.com because they are more in control of the fact that it's their own guest. If it's their own website, they target the marketing towards the guest they want. They build that connection with them, and they're less likely to cancel anyway. But you can control the cancellation terms more if it's a direct booking. You can control them fully. So you've got all of that in play, plus the fact that as Airbnb keeps this guest-centric mindset, people are gaming the system. Guests are. They're knowing what buttons to push with Airbnb to try and get money off their stay or try and get their stay cancelled. And so if you're a host and suddenly you're not seeing the loyalty from Airbnb, you're not seeing the preferential terms, you're not able to add these extra charges, and there's no tangible advantage, suddenly you think, well, I might pull this inventory back off Airbnb, or I might make it cheaper on my own website and not go for rate parity because suddenly I'm less enamored by your guests because they're not loyal to me, they're loyal to you, Airbnb, and you're loyal to them. So it's a very, very interesting time because that situation as it is meets the AI revolution squarely. The timing's impeccable for maybe there to be a rethink for hosts around how important Airbnb is to them, or sorry, how important it should be to try and diversify further.
Yeah, completely agree. I think sort of wrapping up this episode, I would love to leave our listeners with some practical things that they can do in light of some of these changes. So I think one of them that we have already talked about on here quite a bit is this diversification of where they're listing. So making sure that their direct booking website is really up to speed, that it's easy to book, it's easily findable, it's connected to their PMS, making sure they're not relying just on one platform, which a lot of traditionally single hosts, especially in places like the US, have done historically. So that's definitely one. I think expecting cancellations, expecting more of these, adjusting your plans and potentially pricing with this in mind. So it's sort of like when you go to a store and you think, gosh, why is the price of candy so high? Well, it's because people steal candy. So they price in shoplifting. So now our hosts are going to have to price in some of these cancellations. So it's a similar thing. What else, Leo? What else is there that some of our hosts should be aware of and maybe changes they should be making in light of this?
Yeah, so if you're going to be sat alongside hotels, crucially, you need to see what the hotel is doing and try and offer some of these amenities, and services around it that maybe the hotel offers in-house, and try and up your game when it comes to service delivery. Man, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge, but putting the hospitality back into the heart of what you're doing. But in so doing, you can create content about that, and that is going to drive your customer to you. So really have that laser focus on who you think your customer is. There's some great examples of it. We'll have to get them on the show. I'm thinking like Rose Tipka is someone that people should be looking at if they're not, who gets, I think, about 90% of her bookings direct. There's these big family homes, and it's all about, like, the marketing is all geared towards having these great family escapes where everyone just spends 5 days in the nest with each other, jumping in swimming pools and being together. And again, it's like that's like the extreme because she has these specific properties that she's built. Think about who your customer is, because if you know who they are, you're less dependent on the OTA to find them and tell you who it is. And then look, embrace AI. The first thing I do is be going back to callback here, cheeky callback to the Boris episode. Speak with Boris, why not? And also just have a look at what's out there around how you can use AI and automation more to help generate those bookings yourself, because we live in a really interesting time. Like, there's never been a better moment to try and get yourself ahead of the curve and reduce your dependency.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think sort of recapping what's happening, Airbnb definitely becoming much more like some of the other OTAs out there. And that is going to make hosts have to adapt, right? So there's definitely some changes, which we've talked about. Hosts are not necessarily completely out of luck. There are things that can be done. And so this is not a message of, we want it to be empowering and we want it to be helpful, right? It's not just big bad Airbnb, because that's not the case. They're doing what they have to do to be in line with competition and to survive as a company and thrive. So makes perfect sense. And there's things that hosts can do. If any of our listeners have been seeing hotels in the search results in your area, especially those who are maybe in some of these urban environments where we know that Airbnb has long struggled to get supply, please let us know. Let us know how this is impacting you. Let us know how some of the changes have impacted you in terms of the cancellation policies and the buy now, pay later, and some of these other changes that Airbnb has been putting out. We'd love to hear from you.
Sarah, we did it. Well, there you go. We'll talk to you, my friend.
Same here, buddy. What have you got planned for the weekend?
What are we doing? Well, it's Christmas carols in the park because it's that time of year, but it is raining a lot. So it's going to be under umbrellas. But our kids, well, our 4-year-old specifically, is starting to get very excited about Christmas. I believe that there is a tradition. We're new to town, right? We're newish to town, and we didn't notice this last year. There's a tradition that Santa Claus comes round on a kind of like the back of a lorry, almost like a float, and kind of waves at the kids. And I mean, I'll have to video it and maybe I'll put it on the Instagram or the YouTube channel so people can see it to believe it. I think it's going to be quite budget, but equally fun. So my daughter's now convinced that Santa's actually coming to town. So when I told her, she went, "Oh wow, Santa Claus is coming to town!" Like she was doing the lines back. So it's all. She's really learning. She's learning all about Christmas at the moment. So it's fantastic to watch. It really does reinvigorate your love for Christmas. Yeah, and that's it.
That's amazing. I hope that if you don't have a nice singing voice, something tells me, I could be totally wrong, but you're either a fabulous singer or you can't carry a tune to save your life. So if you're the latter, I'm really hoping that you just mouth the words and spare the townspeople, because otherwise you might not make a lot of friends.
Well, look, what we don't know, what we'll never know, because I can't prove it unless I start singing, or if we do a different podcast, which is me singing show tunes. Although I was in my school play, so judge whatever from that. But whether I can sing or not, I'm certainly the sort of person who thinks they can sing.
That's all that matters, buddy. That's all that matters is the confidence.
Part of the problem. Guys, look, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please hit like, share, subscribe in all the usual social places. Next week, we're going to focus on over-tourism, how Southern Europe was always the go-to destination and how that might be changing based on all the circumstances and the locals' reaction to tourists. Tune in. That's going to be a fabulous episode. Till then, see you next week. Thanks.